It's been billed by the White House as the largest deregulatory action in US history. Donald Trump has formally revoked a landmark scientific finding that greenhouse gases endanger public health by driving climate change, a determination that underpins regulations aimed at curbing planet-warming pollution. The repeal is expected to be swiftly challenged in the courts. Let's hear from the US President.
Under the process just completed by the EPA, we are officially terminating the so-called endangerment finding, a disastrous Obama-era policy that severely damaged the American auto industry and massively drove up prices for American consumers. Prices went up incredibly for a worse product. This action will eliminate over $1.3 trillion of regulatory costs and help bring car prices tumbling down dramatically.
As expected, the administration also formally scrapped greenhouse emission standards on cars. Well, with more on how Donald Trump has courted the fossil fuel industry since before his return to the White House, here's Ellen Gainsford.
This crowd of coal miners made an enthusiastic audience for Donald Trump as he announced his pro-fossil fuel agenda. On Wednesday, the president said that the US Army will, in future, give priority to electricity derived from coal.
Clean, beautiful coal. Clean, beautiful coal. We're going to be buying a lot of coal through the military now, and it's going to be less expensive and actually much more effective than what we have been using for many, many years.
Since the start of his second term, Trump has done everything in his power to relaunch the coal industry, providing financial support to plants which may otherwise have closed, and in April, rolling back some regulations.
We're going to be crushing Biden-era environmental restrictions. These are restrictions that made it impossible to do anything having to do, frankly, with energy, even beyond coal.
Trump says coal should be used to power the energy-hungry data centers used by artificial intelligence models. His agenda is a reversal of previous trends in the US. In 2023, coal made up 16% of total energy production, down from 50% in the year 2000. The polluting fossil fuel has been gradually replaced by renewable energy forms, which, according to scientific consensus, are better for the environment and can be less expensive to produce.
If we want to return global warming to 1.5, it's quite clear, what steps need to be taken. We do need very significant reductions in emissions from land use and from energy.
The US is one of the worst emitters of the greenhouse gases that drive global warming, second only to China.
To discuss, we're joined now by Meredith Hankins, Federal Climate Legal Director at the US-based NGO National Resources Defence Council. Thanks so much for being with us on the programme, Meredith. Firstly, what exactly is the endangerment finding and what impact has the mechanism had since it was introduced under the Obama administration? The former president tonight saying this appeal leaves Americans less safe and less healthy.
Yes, so the endangerment finding at its heart is a scientific conclusion backed by mountains of scientific evidence that greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare. And that is important because it triggers EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, their obligation to then regulate greenhouse gases and issue standards like the car and truck standards that the Trump administration has now proposed to repeal.
And how significant is this move then to repeal it? The White House saying this is the largest deregulatory action in US history.
Yes, it really is the single biggest attack in history on the federal government's effort to tackle the climate crisis. It's quite frankly embarrassing, and it is really difficult to wrap even my head around this, that they are walking away from their responsibility and ignoring the broad, well-agreed consensus on climate science.
And what specific consequences is it going to have for ordinary Americans and even people living outside the United States?
Yeah, so most immediately, it's accompanied by a complete repeal of all greenhouse gas standards for cars and trucks. Those standards have been in existence for a decade, and they're being erased from the books. So those standards were predicted to save nearly 8 billion tons of greenhouse gases through 2055 that will now just be going straight into the atmosphere. These rules also would have avoided more than $13 billion a year in healthcare costs as a result of asthma and heart attacks and lung cancer and things like that. And without those standards, all of those health impacts are going to be felt both within the United States. And as we know, greenhouse gases are a global pollutant. And so US emissions will continue to impact the rest of the world as well.
And Meredith, just how much legal and regulatory uncertainty does this move by the Trump administration actually create?
Quite a lot. So they have only officially repealed standards for cars and trucks, but there are still climate standards for greenhouse gas emissions from coal-fired power plants, for example, as well as oil and gas methane leaks. And now those standards are legally vulnerable. And I think it is very confusing to be a regulated industry right now in the United States because you have no idea what rules apply to you, what the government is going to enforce, and most importantly, what to plan for 10 years down the road.
And climate leaders, not surprisingly, pledging to fight back here. What can be done?
Yes. So my organization, NRDC, we will certainly be challenging this as soon as we can in court. We anticipate that this case will eventually go up to the Supreme Court, but the U.S. Supreme Court has already answered this question. They have already told EPA that they have a responsibility and an obligation to regulate dangerous pollution. So we expect to win. Their arguments are really indefensible.
And let's talk a little bit about their arguments then. What's your response to the assertion included in this proposal that greenhouse gases shouldn't be treated as pollutants in the traditional sense of that word because their effects on human health are indirect and global rather than local?
Yeah, so two main objections to that argument. First, it completely reads a requirement into the relevant statute, the Clean Air Act, that simply doesn't exist. The Clean Air Act is about pollutants that endanger human health and welfare. It does not distinguish between so-called local and global pollutants. So that's my first objection. And then second, the EPA has regulated pollutants with a regional or global impact for a really long time. For example, NOx emissions, nitrogen oxide, that come from the combustion of fossil fuels in cars, react with sunlight to form ozone. And ozone is a really dangerous pollutant that leads to smog. And so we regulate NOx because it causes smog, which one could say is an indirect effect. And EPA has been doing that without question since the Clean Air Act was amended in 1970.
And Meredith, the White House also claiming that rolling back this measure is going to ultimately save Americans over $1 trillion. What do you think, though, this repeal is likely to cost in terms of damage to the climate and also healthcare costs?
Yes, that $1 trillion is extremely deceptive. The administration is trying to ignore all of the many well-documented benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and also reducing other emissions, such as particulate matter. We know that reducing those emissions have real monetary and financial impacts on people's health. It helps them stay out of the hospital. It helps lessen the likelihood of asthma attacks and things like that. We also know that climate change continuing to get worse will increase insurance rates. It results in worse and more frequent natural disasters. All of these issues have clear financial impacts. And so by removing these regulations, the Trump administration is only looking at the cost to the regulated industry, that is the cost to comply with these regulations, and is completely ignoring and refusing to acknowledge the other side of the equation. And so while they claim it will save Americans $1 trillion, they're conveniently forgetting or choosing to ignore that the original Biden era standards they were repealing were predicted to save Americans more than $3 trillion.
And Meredith, do you believe that Donald Trump actually does believe that climate change is a hoax? Or is all of this, all of the measures that he's introduced, the policies that he's rode back on, is it just about pandering to the fossil fuel industry?
I'm not sure which is worse. What EPA is doing right now, their initial proposal several months ago did make an attempt to argue that climate change wasn't real. Those arguments were laughable. Scientists from across the United States, across the world, came out of the woodwork to explain how poorly EPA's arguments were crafted in terms of climate science. And so they appear to have abandoned those arguments and are focusing on a more narrow statutory claim that it doesn't matter if climate change is dangerous, we're not going to do anything about it. As far as President Trump personally, it seems pretty clear that he is beholden to the fossil fuel industry, and I really do think that is what's behind all of these efforts.
Meredith, we'll have to leave it there for now. There's an awful lot to discuss. Thank you for your time on the programme and for joining us this evening. That's Meredith Hankins, Federal Climate Legal Director at the US-based NGO, the National Resources Defence Council.